if you've been following the developments in machine learning over the past few years, you may notice some of the advances in like deep learning and artificial neural networks, and they are now used for more and more applications, like from things like image classifications using deep neural nets to even image generation using these so-called like GAN, like generative adversarial networks. They're used in machine translation and also in these large language models like BERTs and GPT. They're not only used these days for transcribing voice dialogues from YouTube videos, but they can also be used to synthesize voices or generate sounds. And like deep networks have been combined with reinforcement learning to achieve some amazing results like AlphaGo and Dota and so on. And like recently, they've also been applied for 3D scene synthesis. So like these scenes are constructed using like Google Maps photos, and like maybe potentially this could be what Google Maps look like in the future. You can just reconstruct the scene from photographs taken. So we see really amazing results. But with all of these, like one of the amazing properties of these the deep learning paradigm that we're in right now in machine learning is that these models are really great at gobbling up knowledge. The bigger the model, the more data it can learn from. So as my friend and colleague Eric Zhang mentioned, that deep neural networks trained with supervised learning are excellent data sponges. These modern architectures like ResNets or transformers that you may have heard of seem to have no trouble absorbing increasingly large data sets when trained using supervised learning. But with all of these advances that we see, these impressive feats in deep learning involves a lot of a sophisticated engineering design. Like for instance, this network is known as the famous AlexNet, which made deep learning famous when it won the ImageNet competition around 10 years ago now. And we can see all these details that were involved in its design, like just crafting out all the different layers and like all the different features. And like modern networks are even more sophisticated and require like a pipeline that spans not only the architecture design, but we also require very careful training schemes. So behind a lot of these amazing feats, lots of sweat and labor had to go into making these results, right? So one of the things that I believe is that the current way we're doing deep learning is really like engineering. I think we're building neural network systems in the same way that we're building like bridges and buildings. So I really like this quote from Andrew Pickering in his book about cybernetics, where he says bridges and buildings are all designed to be indifferent to their environment, to withstand fluctuations, not to adapt to them. The best bridge is one that just stands there, whatever the weather. But in natural systems where collective intelligence play a big role, we see designs that like emerge due to self-organization, like the ants forming a bridge. And such designs are usually sensitive and responsive to changes in the world around them. So natural systems adapt and actually become part of the environments. So how did I always question, how did neural networks end up to be such like an engineering discipline? Why don't we have these kind of like this adaptive networks? So I actually think it didn't have to be this way. The reason deep learning took its course to be where it is now could be just an accidental outcome in the path of history. But in fact, from a historical perspective, in the early days of neural network development, from the 80s, many groups, including the group led by Leon Chua, who is a legendary electrical engineer, worked on neural networks that are actually much closer to these natural adaptive systems. For instance, Chua's group developed something called the cellular neural network, which are artificial neural network circuits with grids of artificial neurons. Each of these neurons would receive signals from their neighbors, perform a weighted sum operation, and apply a nonlinear activation function, just like how we do today, and send a signal off into its neighbor. But the main difference between these networks and today's networks is that they were built using analog circuits, meaning that they would work just approximately, but also at the time in the 80s and 90s, they were much faster than digital circuits. Also, the wiring of every cell is exactly the same. So the weights, so to speak, of every single neuron or around the neuron are the same, unlike the current systems. So what is remarkable is that even in the late 80s, they have shown that these networks can produce amazing results like object extraction. So you have this image of lots of like these ducks and or geese, and you select a few initial states, and then it'll keep those images and remove everything else. Like so these like tasks can only be done decades later in deep learning, after AlexNet. They can also do things like that are non-trivial for hand-coded systems, like select all objects that are pointing upwards and remove all the other objects by programming a few parameters on these analog systems. And this was in the late 80s and early 90s, and these chips that they fabricated can work in nanoseconds. That's something that also required decades for digital circuits to match up. So, but in the last few years, though, I've been noticing that many advances and works in the deep learning research has also popped up that have been using some of these ideas from collective intelligence, in particular, the area of the emergent complex systems. Recently, we even wrote the survey paper about these works, which I'll discuss. And this is basically the topic of this talk. So the problem is like the collective intelligence is a huge topic. So we can only narrow in and discuss some areas. So I won't be talking about learning from collective human intelligence and these interesting behaviors from animals and insects. But luckily, the previously Ulrich Pellet gave a great talk on the subject. Instead, in this talk, I'm gonna look at examples of things like modular repetitive systems, and in contrast to a fixed engineering design. And I'll also be looking at the dynamic self-organization versus static fixed organization. And lastly, I'll look at things like the massive artificial swarms versus the single agent paradigm in deep reinforcement learning. So in the survey paper, I identified 4 topics to discuss. First is like image processing generative models. Second is the deep reinforcement learning. Third is multi-agent learning, and the last one that I'll touch on is on the field of meta learning or learning to learn. So let's dive right in. In the simplest example, in collective systems and complex systems is like cellular automata, like in this game of life, where every cell updates depending on the states of its neighboring cells. So such a system like this can be adapted to deep learning in neural networks. And recently, there has been a work called a neurocellular automata, which is basically a cellular automata system where every cell is a neural network that's a function of its immediate neighbors. So this is something that's actually very similar to cellular neural networks that I discussed earlier that came out in the late 80s. But now it's been we can do it with modern GPUs, parallel processing, and scale some of these experiments up. So in this work, led by Mordinsky and his collaborators, they were able to train these neurocellular automata systems to regenerate images. Like for example, this image of a lizard or a gecko by only like having one single pixel change itself depending on the states of its neighbors. So what's incredible is you can start having one single pixel somewhere on the screen, and as you updates the system, you can see the entire image generates based on this cellular automata rules, which is kind of a surprising result because usually we would generate images using a more structured way. And some examples of neurocellular automata is its ability to generate like a few patterns, but also if you mess these patterns around, they can also regenerate similar patterns that is possibly from the same data distribution. So these systems are more robust to noise compared to traditional deep learning generative models. But sometimes they also have kind of a funny results. The neurocellular automata has also been applied not for image generation, but also for things like classifying MNIST digits. But that's a popular task in machine learning. So in this example, they have a demo where we can draw digits interactively in the web browser, and every single cell here is a neural network classifier, and they have to determine what digit is being drawn by only using the local information, the pixel that that it's located at, and also they have to discover a message passing scheme to communicate with their neighbors so that they can collectively come up with a prediction rather than having like a traditional neural network do this classification. But I thought this is a pretty interesting example because we can see the process in which they come up with these classification, and sometimes they can fight over whether they think it's an 8 or it's a 0, depending on where the location of the cell is. So these cellular networks have also been applied to Minecraft. In this other work led by Shaim and his collaborators, they applied this NeuroCA is quite creative. They applied it to these Minecraft objects, and they're able to regenerate Minecraft buildings in some approximate form, and also regenerate Minecraft trees. So they kind of do something like a procedural generation. But what's really interesting here is because in Minecraft, many of these objects are not static; they're movable. They can have some functions. They try to generate these functional machines, like these worm-like creatures that can move forward. So what's interesting here is they show that there's a morphogenesis property of these creatures. So they can use cellular automata to generate a functional machine that can move forward. But they can also, like perhaps like a real worm, they can cut this creature in half and have each creature regenerates, into the full creature, and have these become two different functional machines that move forward. So I think this is a kind of a creative experiment because it moves, it changes something from a image generation or image recognition into something that's closer to generating a machine or an organism, which is closer to what I'm going to discuss next in reinforcement learning. So traditionally in reinforcement learning, there's a lot of benchmarks. People like to train neural networks to perform, for example, locomotion tasks on these simulated humanoid. And what happened is like on this is kind of the difficult version of the simulation. You actually have like 376 observations. There's a lot of states in the sky, and at every time step we have to output 17 actions. So what happens is you have a deep neural network where you take in 376 things, you process it through a few layers, and you have to output 17 things. And basically you give the training enough scenarios or enough trials so that it basically knows exactly what to do in every single state. And you see that you can really maximize the performance in the simulator. But sometimes the policies don't look so realistic, and they're kind of flaky. They don't really transfer well to other environments or other morphologies. So this area is, I saw some interesting works that applied cellular type systems to tackle these problems as well. A recent work used an interesting approach to train these like locomotion or humanoid agents. So rather than training one single neural network, to take in all of the inputs and output all of the outputs. What they did was they broke down these agents into all of their like individual joints, and every joint is controlled by one single neural network, like one single policy. But like in cellular systems, this policy is shared and replicated amongst all of the other joints. So like the hand, the limb, and the feet, they're all controlled using the exact same neural network. So with the same weights, but just duplicated. And each of these limbs and joints have to communicate to their neighbors using message passing. Like so you have like a top-down message passing and bottom-up message passing when you're communicating across the entire agents. So they try to train one single policy to control every single joint of an agent. But not only that, they try to train one single policy to to make it work on all of these different agents. So not just the humanoid, but also these like a half cheetahs, little jumping sticks, and so on. So one single policy has to control like all the joints of all of these different creatures. And the results were really interesting. They show that these policies can generalize to unseen agents without further training. So they held out some designs that were not shown during training, and they still sort of work. Like these really weird designs, like like a much bigger legs. Some of these were simply not seen during training, and they're still able to work to some extent. And also they can also do things like maintaining balance of a ball during tests when during training there's no objects like this. So I think these systems are really interesting because they allow like adaptation without being trained to adapt. Another work related to reinforcement learning is inspired by modular robotics, and this work is called a self-assembling reinforcement learning agents, led by Pathak and his group. So here, rather than training one single the design to do some task like standing up or a locomotion task, what they do is you instead you train a bunch of small limb components like the previous work. But unlike the previous work I discussed, these limbs have to figure out how they should self-assemble and also do the task at the same time. So you're really training the agents to do both the policy and come up with its own design on the fly to do these tasks. And the results were really exciting. Like for instance, for the stand up task, what they found was if you train the system the traditional way using RL, it took a long time for that to work, and it doesn't really generalize to other things like like a more limbs or less limbs. But using this system to train agents to self-organize into some design and to do the task, they have some great generalization results. So here's a video of these agents generalizing to twice as many limbs, and it can still sort of stand up, not as well, but it still kind of work. And this task would not work in the vanilla RL because it doesn't generalize. Even for less limbs, it works really well, and the vanilla RL methods will not work for these. This collective system works really well when we apply extra random pushes and pulls, and the vanilla RL system is not that robust to these perturbations. And for things like locomotion task, they can self-assemble into some sort of creature that can move forward, and like this is something really difficult for RL to do. And what's amazing is on this task, it'll generalize to using twice as many limbs, just like before, or it can generalize to other environments like these terrains with hurdles. And I think the last one, they have a result where they can generalize to climbing stairs. And during training, these agents have never seen stairs. So I think this is a really exciting work that was presented at NeurIPS 2 years ago. Another work that I'll discuss is from my group led by Eugene Tang, and this one where we try to apply the ideas from self-attention and also self-organization to get agents to adapt to a changing observation space. So in other words, we want an agent to play this car racing game not by looking at the screen on the left, but looking at the screen on the right when everything is constantly shuffled. So really, every single sensory input has to not only learn how to do the task, but also learn the context of where that input is or what that input is in relation to its neighbors. So this is kind of inspired by the idea in the sensory substitution, because as humans, we have this ability to some change the meaning of our sensory substitutions. Like there's this brilliant line of work from pioneer Paul Baccarita, where he's shown that the people who were blind can be trained to still see after some time using electrode grids in the tongue. But although that takes some time, the motivation is work is, can we also get machine learning systems to do something like that on the fly? And the idea is to have like a population of neurons to compose compose our agents, and each of these sensory neurons have to figure out the context, the meaning of its inputs, and communicate to the rest of the population using an attention mechanism. So this is kind of the high level picture of how it works. And like we can apply these this system to this like a locomotion task, where like every single one of these 28 observations are constantly shuffled and reshuffled, and our agent will continue to work, and the standard policy will just fail. And then like an Atari pawn game, we can get an agent to play in this shuffled game that can just like, and it's constantly reshuffled, and it'll still work. And this is actually quite difficult for humans as well. And what's remarkable is like these networks can work with less data than the one we supplied during training, and it'll still work to some extent. So there's that degree of robustness that I talked about. And there's some unexpected generalization results. Like when we train agents to be permutation invariants, they're able to perform in some environments that are out of the domain, like when we change the background, and it'll still sort of work. So this is kind of the results of our recent work. The next topic I want to discuss in multi-agent learning, which is inspired by collective intelligence. So recently, in the area of multi-agent RL, people have tried to scale up reinforcement learning or multi-agent reinforcement learning to up to hundreds of thousands or even 1 million agents by using GPUs. So this work was from 2018. So I thought this was really interesting work, because like it's the first work that showed thousands or hundreds of thousands of these simple agents, and they can simulate swarm behavior, predator prey, like self play systems using these populations of agents. And I think this is an exciting direction going forward as well. In particular, just in 3 years, the GPUs or hardware have advanced really fast. Like the NVIDIA keeps on coming out with like larger and like better GPUs, and now we can like we see these recent work where you can actually simulate to some accuracy thousands of simulated robots, and within minutes, and they can learn skills like locomotion skills in a population-based way compared to a single agent. So I'm not gonna talk so much about that. So that's I think is in a very exciting direction. And the last topic I want to touch on is can we apply collective systems or collective intelligence to meta learning? Can we try to get a system to learn something better than gradient descent? So if you're familiar with how neural networks are trained for supervised learning, what usually happens is like you have like an image, like a handwritten digit that gets passed into the inputs, and it's a feed forward network where you would feed forward several layers of weights until you get to the prediction. And the prediction, you would train it on your training data set and get a prediction error. And you will use an algorithm called backpropagation to backpropagate those errors back through your weights, thereby computing all of the gradients. And once you have all of the gradients, you can update the weights of your neural network to minimize the error between the targets and the prediction. So that's how deep learning traditionally works. But here, there has been some really interesting works last year that tries to generalize the notion of a neural network. Like for instance, rather than using the backpropagation algorithm, they replace you can replace every single weight, every single connection, like a synapse, so to speak, of these artificial neural network with a neural network itself. So you can actually have like a super neural network where every connection is an identical neural network. And what they show is they can train these connections to learn. If we want to, they can learn the gradient descent. They can actually replicate exactly the backpropagation algorithm if we train it to do so. Because like the every recurrent neural network connection is a Turing complete machine. And what's exciting is, can we try to train these collective systems to learn how to learn, or to learn better than gradient descent? I think this direction is very promising, and it can lead uh, to better neural network systems in the future that are much more sample efficient than deep learning, and maybe perhaps can learn at a much faster rate than what we can do right now. So I didn't really have time to cover everything in the survey. I only chose a few examples, but the themes, the takeaway message is, in the summary, is that these ideas from collective intelligence can be applied to machine learning or deep learning to really move the needle. And I think that's needed in the next few years of this development. In particular, we can produce systems that can better adapt to the environments, that are more robust to out of the distribution shifts, like generalization. And I believe these collective systems are key ingredients for when we want to build systems that can learn to learn. And recently, we're working on a manuscript, and this paper, this survey is also available on arXiv if anyone is interested to go through it as well. Okay, so I think I'm just on time. So let me close this, and I'm done for the talk. Yeah, thank you.